Dialogue and the South Asia program of Cornell University. I would like to welcome you to this 4-day-long virtual international conference titled 50 Years of Bangladesh, Retrospect and Prospect. This session would be chaired by Professor Ronald Jahan. So before I hand over to her to start the proceedings of the session, I would like to introduce her. Then she would be moderating the session and chair the session. So Professor Ronald Jahan is a distinguished fellow of the Center for Policy Dialogue. She was a senior research scholar and adjunct professor at Columbia University from 1990 to 2010, and a professor of political science at Dhaka University from 1970 to 1982. She headed the women's program at UNAPDC from 1982 to 1984 and the International Labour Organization from 1985 to 1989. She was a research fellow at Harvard, Chicago, and Boston universities and was the Rajni Kothari Professor at CSDS, New Delhi, India in 2010. Professor Jahan received her PhD in political science from Harvard University. She is the author of several books. Some of them include Pakistan, Failure in National Integration, published by Columbia University Press in 1972, Women and Development, Perspectives from South and Southeast Asia, co-editor, published by Bilia, Bangladesh Institute of Law and International Affairs in 1979, Bangladesh Politics, Problems and Issues, published by University Press Limited in 1980 and in 2005. The Elusive Agenda, Mainstreaming Women in Development, published by Z Books in 1995. Bangladesh, Promise and Performance, she was the editor and contributor, published by Z Books in 2000. Political Parties in Bangladesh, Challenges of Democratization, published by Prathoma in 2015. Professor Jahan is the founder president of Women for Women, which is an organization in Bangladesh. She served on the boards of Population Council and International Council of the Asia Society, New York. At present, she is on the boards of Research Initiative Bangladesh, RIB, and the Center for Policy Dialogue. She is on the advisory board of Human Rights Watch, Asia, New York, South Asia program of Cornell University, Journal of Human Rights, University, also Journal of Bangladesh Studies, BDI, Social Change, Sage India, and Pratichinta, Prathoma. She is the chair of the advisory group of Bangladesh Health Watch. Professor Jahan represented Bangladesh in the 32nd session of the United Nations General Assembly in 1977 and participated in drafting of CEDAW. She was awarded the Radcliffe Institute Graduate Society Award of Harvard University in 2008. So with this, now I would like to hand over to Professor Ronald Jahan to chair the session.
Thank you very much, Fahmida. Let me first of all say that it's very kind of you to introduce me in a very long way, which I'm not going to introduce the rest of you, including you and Professor Iftikhar Dadi, and give all of your accomplishments. So I'm going to introduce everybody else by just their name and affiliation. So my apologies at the beginning. Let me first of all welcome you all who have joined us virtually in this inaugural session of our conference, which Famida has already mentioned, is titled 50 Years of Bangladesh, Retrospect and Prospect, which CPD is organizing to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of our independence. We greatly appreciate that the South Asia program of Cornell University is co-hosting this initiative, so we welcome them. For our generation who have witnessed the birth of Bangladesh as an adult, the month of December brings back our special memories of high hopes and anticipation. 50 years ago, on this very day, December 6, 1971, we realized that our victory is around the corner, that we are about to realize our dream of an independent Bangladesh. We knew that the birth of Bangladesh is going to be an unprecedented historical event. It will be the first example of a nationalist movement gaining recognition of statehood, becoming an independent state from the domination of a post-colonial state. We were exhilarated at our prospects. At the same time, we were also worried how we will rebuild a war-ravaged economy and society with our limited resources. Our journey in the last 50 years have not been easy. We have seen ups and downs. We have seen progress in many fronts. We have also seen reversals and backslides in some. But what inspires us is that we have remained steadfast in our struggles to reclaim what we all call Mukti Juddher Chetona, spirit of liberation war. Of course, each of us define that Chetona in our own ways. What is also inspiring us is that we have kept our faith in a bright future for our nation. We, of course, also celebrate our achievements in key indicators of human development and economic development. But also we take cognizance that we have deviated from and made some compromises with some of our fundamental principles, such as democracy, secularism, and socialism. I consider it a particular privilege that I have been able to be associated with the organization of this conference celebrating the Golden Jubilee of Bangladesh. Some of you may recall that I organized a similar conference in 1996 at Columbia University to celebrate the Silver Jubilee of Bangladesh. CPD, though only 3 years old at that time, was the co-sponsor of that conference. I think it is yet another measure of our progress that after 25 years, this time CPD is the organizer of the 50-year celebration of Bangladesh, and Cornell University is the co-sponsor. Some of the participants of this conference were also present at the 1996 Columbia University conference. Some of them I mentioned is Professor Raymond Soban, Dr. Binayak Sen, Dr. Hussein Zillur, Dr. Habib Khondokar, and Professor Ilora Shahabuddin. It is heartening to see that they have continued their commitment to research and writing for the last 25 years. In this inaugural session, I'm joined by 3 other panelists, Dr. Fahmida Khatun, who introduced me, who is an economist, and she is also the executive director of CPD, and Professor Iftikhar Dadi, who is himself an artist, as well as a professor in the Department of History of Arts, and also the director of South Asia program at Cornell University. And our keynote speaker for this conference, Professor Raymond Soban, who is an economist who has been involved with our nationalist struggle since the 1960s, participated in the Mukti Juddho in 1971, and have been involved in our nation building efforts in various capacities in the last 50 years. He is also the chairman of CPD. I would also like to introduce Abra Bhattacharjee, who may wish to show his face or not show his face, who is in charge of CPD dialogue and outreach activities, who will assist me in the challenging tasks of timekeeping and other technical matters. Since my technical skills are near zero, Dr. Fahmida Khatun will select and read out questions during the Q&A sessions. So I request all participants to send their questions in the chat box. Every day, Fahmida presides over some dialogue or other. So she's super excellent in selecting questions. I shall now, at a later point, I shall discuss a little bit more in detail the objectives of this conference and also some of the themes of the conference. But at this stage, I would like to invite first Dr. Fahmida Khatun, and after that, Professor Iftikhar Dadi, to welcome the participants on behalf of their respective institutions. So Fahmida, the floor is yours, and you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Respected Chair of this session, Professor Ronald Jahan, Founding Chair of the Center for Policy Dialogue, Professor Raymond Soban, Director, South Asia Program, Cornell University, and co-organizer of this program, Professor Iftikhar Dadi, distinguished panelists, speakers, and chairs of various sessions. Participants, colleagues, and friends, good evening, good afternoon, good morning. So on behalf of the Center for Policy Dialogue, I once again welcome you to this 4-day-long virtual international conference titled 50 Years of Bangladesh, Retrospect and Prospect, to celebrate the 50 years of Bangladesh's independence. This program, as you already know, starts today and continues till the 9th of December. While the chair of this session has already set the context of this conference and will elaborate on the program, I take this opportunity to shed lights on CPD's mission and activities briefly. Established in 1993 by Professor Raymond Soban, CPD is now a leading think tank in Bangladesh and also in South Asia. Many of you may recall the center was established at a time when the country had just embarked upon the path of electoral democracy, following 1.5 decades of military rule, following the killing of the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, in 1975. At that point in time, civil society was in a nascent stage of development, and the need to organize and strengthen the voice of independent, non-partisan civil society, particularly of the left behind and marginalized people, was deeply felt by concerned citizens. Hence, CPD's founding chair, Professor Raymond Soban, came forward to fill this void by establishing CPD. Throughout its 28-year-long journey, the guiding vision of CPD has been the establishment of an inclusive society based on equity, justice, fairness, and good governance. Over the years, CPD has made significant contribution to policy analysis on issues such as macroeconomic management, political economy, international trade, global value chain development, sustainable development goals, regional cooperation, gender, health, education, climate change, and environment, among many other issues. Some of the important ongoing activities of CPD include the following: the fallouts of the COVID-19 pandemic and post-COVID recovery process, post-LDC graduation challenges and smooth transition strategy, efficient and clean energy and power sector, securing green transition in the textile and ready-made garments industry, climate finance and investment, importance of data for effective policymaking, future of war during the 4th Industrial Revolution, and skills development for youth employment. Bangladesh at 50 conference is the continuation of CPD's broad work agenda. Over the last 28 years, CPD has closely examined the socio-economic development of Bangladesh, made rigorous analysis through evidence and data, and engaged in policy influencing through dissemination of the findings across broader stakeholders, including the policymakers. Therefore, CPD's desire to organize this international conference on Bangladesh at 50 originates from its very nature of commitments and activities and the mission it pursues, which is to service the growing aspiration of Bangladeshi civil society for a demand-driven and accountable development process by stimulating informed debate, generating knowledge, and influencing policymakers through research, dialogue, outreach, and advocacy. CPD is thankful to Professor Ronald Jahan for conceptualizing this conference and steering the organization of the conference tirelessly for the last several months. Our deep gratitude to Professor Raymond Soban, who has provided intellectual support and coordinated with the experts of the conference. I would also like to thank the members of CPD's Board of Trustees for their inputs during the design of this conference. CPD's research and dialogue divisions have provided excellent support for the successful organization of this conference. We are very happy that the South Asia program of Cornell University has joined CPD in its endeavor to reflect on Bangladesh's journey in economic, social, cultural, and political spheres over the last 50 years. Our sincere thanks to the session chairs, paper presenters, and discussants. We are looking forward to a rich discussion on various aspects of Bangladesh's journey and the way forward. I also thank all of you who have joined us today from various parts of the world and from various time zones. I hope you will stay with us throughout these 4 days and take part in a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Fahmida. I would now like to invite Professor Iftikhar Dadi to say a few words of welcome. Professor Dadi has woken up very early in the morning to welcome you all. So, Professor Dadi, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ronald Jahan. It's an honor for me to be, and for the Cornell South Asia program to be associated with this landmark conference to celebrate and recognize the achievements of Bangladesh during the last 50 years. I'll say a few words to introduce the South Asia program at Cornell University, which is, it serves as an interdisciplinary hub for students, faculty, staff, community members, and academic visitors. We are one of the 8 South Asia programs which are designated as the National Resource Center by the United States Department of Education. And in this, we are in collaboration with the Syracuse University South Asia Center. And our mandate is to cover all of South Asia. So that includes research and discussion on India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Bhutan, and the Maldives. South Asia program has more than 50 affiliated, the Cornell South Asia program has more than 50 affiliated faculty from across Cornell's colleges and schools. And they work in a wide variety of areas and disciplines in the humanities, social sciences, and the natural sciences. We offer 11 South Asian languages, which includes Bengali, Hindi, Nepali, Punjabi, Sanskrit, Sinhala, Tibetan, and Urdu. We support our undergraduate and graduate students, as well as faculty research to expand knowledge and international understanding of South Asia across the Cornell community. We sponsor a weekly seminar every semester with presentations by leading scholars working on diverse topics. We also hold conferences and workshops organized by Cornell faculty and students. We also are engaged in outreach programs in our region in upstate New York state to educators at the K through 12 schools, community colleges, and schools of education in central New York. So it's a great pleasure to be associated with this conference. I wanted to thank the manager of the South Asia program, Daniel Bass, who also assisted in the organization from our end. I look forward very much to the next 4 days and to learning more about the achievements of Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dadi, for your introduction of Cornell's program. I think many in the audience probably don't know about this, so I think this is very helpful to know. And we look forward to Cornell organizing many more programs on Bangladesh in future. Thank you, Professor Dadi. Let me now turn to discussing the objectives and the themes of the conference. And I will try to do that briefly in the next 15 minutes. I thought that since all the paper presenters were given only 14 minutes at the beginning and 4 minutes at the end, I should not also take too much time. So let me first talk about the objectives of this conference. We had several objectives, but here I will flag mainly 6 main goals that we had. First, we want to tell the story of Bangladesh's development, not in fragments, in terms of only gains made in indicators of social and economic development. We think that limiting ourselves to the discourse of only quote and unquote development, which has dominated the attention of our academia and the media in recent years, this constrains our vision. After all, Mukti Juddher Chetona was not just about development. In this conference, we have tried to capture the vast landscape of changes that have taken place in all sectors of our country, in our economy, society, environment, politics, and culture. We have invited scholars from multiple disciplines: social science, history, humanities, arts, architecture, to portray the story of Bangladesh in multiple dimensions. Second, we want to tell the story of Bangladesh not simply through presentation of quantitative data, though data is important, but it should be supplemented with critical analysis of processes, actors, and actions, which have resulted in the changes in quantitative numbers. The upward or downward trends in life expectancy, mortality, fertility, school enrollment, labor force participation, poverty reduction, export earnings, GDP growth, foreign exchange reserve, etc., do indicate significant gains that we have made in social and economic development. But for a deeper understanding of our developments, we need to know what have been the drivers of change in Bangladesh, who are the actors, and what are the actions that led to significant gains in the indicators of human and economic development over the last 5 decades. Third, we want to discuss not simply our achievements, though we can justifiably be proud of our achievements and need to celebrate them in this Golden Jubilee year. But we also want to note our shortfalls and mistakes so that we can learn lessons from them for course correction in the future. Most important, we want to identify the challenges that lie ahead, particularly in the post-COVID changing world order, when competition for survival and domination will be more intense. We are cognizant that in an era of quote and unquote fake news and quote and unquote alternative facts, truth-telling has become difficult and risky. But as academics, it is our special responsibility to be truthful to facts and evidence. we need to take up that special responsibility. Fourth, we want to challenge established wisdom, analytical framework, and easy branding that have been used for long to craft the narrative of Bangladesh. The paper writers and discussants have been encouraged to feel free to propose new theories and analytical frameworks based on Bangladesh's own experiences and not try to fit the Bangladesh story to establish theories based on the experiences of other countries. For example, paper writers have been asked to ponder whether Bangladesh is really a quote and unquote paradox, by which the Western media means success in economic growth with deficit in good governance. Or have there really been sharp divides in policies with regime changes in our country? Or have there been a gradual shift in policies over different regimes? Or have there been some continuing trends over the last 50 years? So paper writers were really encouraged to challenge existing frameworks. Fifth, we have brought together scholars, whether based in Bangladesh or outside Bangladesh, Bangladeshis as well as non-Bangladeshis, who have done research on Bangladesh in different fields. Some have demonstrated enduring interest for nearly 50 years. Some are relatively new. What binds us all together is our common research interest in Bangladesh studies. We need to take stock of the state of scholarship on Bangladesh in different fields and identify gaps in our research. There are many topics and issues which have not been investigated by the researchers. For example, research on political parties or political topics or class relations are limited. Though we talk a lot about the power of the new business class, there is hardly any book that analyzes the evolution and rise of this class. So what we need to discuss is how we can promote better scholarship. Finally, we envision an edited conference volume which can serve as a standard text or reference book in colleges and universities around the world. At present, only a few universities outside Bangladesh offer courses on Bangladesh, and Bangladesh generally does not feature in courses on South Asia. Absence of standard reference books is often cited as an excuse for non-representation of Bangladesh in South Asia courses and programs in universities outside of Bangladesh. I feel very strongly that this gap needs to be filled urgently, and I hope the proposed conference volume will serve to fill this gap. The Columbia Conference in 1996 that I referred to earlier that I organized, that led to the publication of a book which was published by Z Books in 2000 called Bangladesh Promise and Performance, and which I know has served as a standard reference book in many universities in Bangladesh as well as outside. I have in mind, and we have in mind, a similar and a better publication on Bangladesh out of this particular conference. I strongly believe that igniting interest in Bangladesh, not simply as a test case of development, but as an old civilization with a long tradition of literature, art, architecture, music, diversity, tolerance, people's movements, etc., will create an abiding and sustainable image about our country and its people in the minds of youths in Bangladesh and globally, who, after all, will lead the course of history in the future. So I think generally in Bangladesh, we think of branding in a very sense, and we're always talking about attracting foreign direct investment. But I think if we are thinking of branding Bangladesh and representing Bangladesh, we should think in different ways of branding Bangladesh and giving representation to Bangladesh. And I think promoting scholarship is one of the better ways of promoting branding in a very lasting manner. Let me now turn to the themes of the conference. The conference is bringing together 47 leading scholars from different countries and different disciplines. 20 papers will be presented in 8 different sessions. And I have been pleasantly surprised that we have already received most of the papers before the conference began. In this inaugural session, Professor Raymond Soban will make a keynote presentation, which will celebrate Mujib Borsho. His paper is titled Bangabandhu's Vision of a Just Society, Promises Kept and Promises to Keep. This paper will expand on the theme of the conference. Originally, we had thought that Professor Soban will give this Mujib Borsho lecture as a separate event, but later we thought that his paper will fit very well as a part of our conference, because it will not only talk about Bangabandhu's vision, but it will also set the agenda of our conference. Our conference focuses on 6 themes. Panel 2, which will follow right after our inaugural panel, this panel, discusses the theme of state, society, and politics. 3 papers are presented which highlight the evolution of regime types, state-society relations, changing power relations between classes and groups, the nature, scope, and pathway of Islamist politics, evolution and use of violence in politics. The papers identify some enduring features of Bangladesh politics: a tendency towards authoritarianism, weakness of democratic institutions, growing dominance of money and muscle power, weak rule of law, lack of transparency and accountability, etc. They also raise some interesting new questions about the issue of legitimacy and pluralism. I will not read out the names of the panelists. This is available in the links given to the registered participants, so you can just click the links. Our next panel, panel 3, which will be tomorrow on December 7, focuses on Bangladesh's economic transformation. Here, 3 papers will discuss the story of the evolution of Bangladesh's economic growth over the last 5 decades, identifying the drivers of growth, tipping points, and synergies. The challenges that lie ahead for Bangladesh in the LDC post-graduation era are explored, and the enduring institutional challenges that the state must address to make growth sustainable are analyzed. Again, there are 7 panelists, and you can find their names in the links that are given to you. Tomorrow's last panel, panel 4, explores the theme of a just society. I would like to note here that it is not simply us academics, but even our school children have been demonstrating on the streets since 2008, demanding justice. So our title of this particular panel is very relevant. Here, 3 papers are presented that discuss the issues of poverty, inequality, and governance. And you can find the names of panelists in your links. On the 3rd day, that is December 8, we have 2 panels. Panel 5 analyzes the theme of social transitions. Here again, 3 papers are presented that look at the evolution of human development and social changes, gender equality and women's empowerment, and civic activism. Again, I would request you to get the names of the panelists from your links. The last panel on the 3rd day is on culture. Here, 4 papers are presented on diverse issues such as contestations over our identity, changes in cultural norms, changes in architecture, urban and settlement landscapes, and contemporary art movement. Ideally, we should have had 2 separate panels for this, but because of constraint of time, we had to put together these diverse topics in one panel. Again, I will request you all to click the link and find the names of the panelists. The last day we have 2 panels. panel 7, focuses on the theme of costs and challenges of development. 3 papers are presented. 2 of them will look at the issues of the costs that we have paid for our economic growth. These costs have been borne by environment and also by our working classes, our domestic and migrant labor. The 3rd paper discusses just not so much cost, but the current and the future challenge, and that is the changing geopolitics, which Bangladesh has to negotiate carefully in coming years. Again, the names of the panelists you can find in your links. The last and the concluding session, panel 8, we have conceived as an open forum for discussion. It focuses on discussion of key challenges Bangladesh will face in a post-COVID changing world order. The panel is chaired by Professor Raymond Soban. The open discussion will be initiated by 4 panelists who will speak for 5 to 7 minutes. The issues that they will start with to initiate the discussion are climate change and environment, development strategies, social equality, and future of democracy. Though the papers are being presented in 6 different themes and 6 different sessions, all papers underscore the interlinks between developments in economy, politics, society, and culture. They all argue that development in one sector cannot be understood with reference to developments in other sectors. All papers also note that while we need to celebrate our achievements, we also need to recognize our shortfalls and take corrective measures. The importance of returning to our foundational principles, democracy, secularism, and socialism, is a recurring theme in all the papers. Well, as you can see, that you can all look forward to a real feast of ideas and arguments for 4 days in a row. So right now, what I would like to do is turn to Professor Raymond Soban to start the ball rolling. He will initiate our discussion of the conference with his keynote presentation, which he has titled as Bangabandhu's Vision of a Just Society, Promises Kept and Promises to Keep. As I have noted earlier, that this is also our Mujib Borsho lecture, which we had planned earlier, but we have decided that he will give our Mujib Borsho lecture as at the beginning of our conference. So I will request now Professor Soban to take the floor. And Professor Soban, you can, I hope, deliver your lecture in the next 40 to 45 minutes so that we have time for some Q&A. I know that generally in a lecture, no time is left for Q&A, but I know that audience and participants often want to ask questions. So we have kept a little time for that. So over to you, Professor Soban, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Professor Jahan. And again, thank you for the introduction to the general width and depth of this conference and the creative perspectives that you are in fact we are projecting before this global audience. My presentation today is focused on Bangabandhu's vision for a just society. This is the Bangabandhu centenary year, and it is approaching its conclusion. And my emphasis on a just society is consistent with his own deeply felt feeling throughout his public life, which guided his participation first in a democratic struggle, and then in its final denouement in the struggle for national liberation, but which was built around his vision of a just society. I have subtitled this promises kept and promises to keep, because within the limited lifespan that he was given, he actually did realize a very significant part of the promises he made to the nation through the emergence of an independent Bangladesh. However, he had further dreams of what a post-liberation Bangladesh would look like, and he was not given this opportunity to see this through. But for 50 years now, we have moved into a situation where we can reflect on this, and we have been privileged that his party and his heir, in fact, has been in office for the last 13 or 14 years, and has, in fact, had the opportunity to reflect on what parts of the vision could be realized. Now, the commemoration of Bangabandhu centenary year and the celebration centered around Bangladesh's 50 years as an independent nation state will be reaching their conclusion at the end of the calendar year. My Bangabandhu centenary lecture is thus appropriately cited as the presentation of this public event, which brings all of you together to address the journey of Bangladesh at 50, in order to reflect on the road already traveled and explore the challenges which confront us in the journey ahead. My presentation will look at this journey through the lens of Bangabandhu's own vision for an independent Bangladesh, which he promised would evolve into a just society. I will explore how far we as a nation and people have so far moved to realize Bangabandhu's promise, and what parts of his promise remain to be kept in the days ahead. The presentation will be structured under three themes: the vision, Bangabandhu's vision for an independent Bangladesh, then promises kept, the realization of the vision, and third, promises to keep, the prospects for realizing this vision. Bangabandhu epitomized his vision for Bangladesh before the people at the conclusion of his epic declaration at the race course on 7th March 1971. Ebare Shongram amader muktir Shongram. Ebare Shongram Shadhinata Shongram. Many people have pondered on the distinction between the struggle for independence, Shadhinata, and the struggle for liberation, Mukti. Bangabandhu is perhaps clearer in his mind about the distinction. He visualized the struggle for independence as a struggle for the establishment of a sovereign nation state, a more readily understood goal which inspired the struggle by other nation states to emancipate themselves from colonial rule. But his call for liberation was a more nuanced and hence more far-reaching call. It extended the struggle beyond the realization of independence towards the move towards a more transformatory mission of liberating the people from not just unjust bondage of Pakistani rule, but from injustices inflicted on people over centuries. Years of subordination had denied the people not just their democratic rights, but had held them captive within an unjust social order, which frustrated their capabilities and limited their opportunities to live a decent, dignified, and fulfilling life. Bangabandhu's commitment and struggle has ultimately realized through the emergence of an independent Bangladesh. But Bangladesh had to fight a liberation war, which cost us countless lives, massive destruction of our infrastructure, the complete dislocation of our economy, and major structural changes in our social order. Bangladesh survived the trauma of our blood-stained birth and moved forward over the next half-century to significantly elevate the economic fortunes, experience remarkable social transformation, and to reconfigure our place in a more globalized world order. Little if this would have been possible had we not managed in the immediate aftermath of liberation to resurrect ourselves as a people from the ashes and debris of the liberation war, to construct a nation state, build its institutions, and establish our presence in the comity of nations. that such a resurgence could be realized within 3 years of our national liberation owes in no small measure to the inspirational leadership of Bangabandhu, supported by those who worked with him over long hours with limited resources under the most adverse circumstances to build a nation state. In the course of building a nation state, Bangabandhu projected his vision for realizing Amader Mukti Sangram through the 4 fundamental pillars incorporated in the Bangladesh Constitution, presented to the nation state within a year of our national liberation. The 4 founding principles, democracy, nationalism, secularism, socialism, were inspired by Bangabandhu's own lifelong struggle for self-rule, followed by his heroic endeavor to transform a movement for self-rule into a native state. And we are comforted to appreciate that his struggle did not go in vain. When the assassin bullet cut short Bangabandhu's life, he had realized the most cherished part of his life's mission, the emergence of an independent Bangladesh. But all his achievements remained a work in progress. The struggle for Amader Mukti Sangram remained unfinished. It would thus be appropriate to proclaim as his epitaph the words of the poet Robert Frost, which so inspired President John F. Kennedy. I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. Perhaps the most significant measure, I here now speak about the promises kept. Perhaps the most significant measure of Bangladesh's progress could be captured through a comparison of our progress in various areas of human endeavor compared to our erstwhile rulers, Pakistan. Many of us academics who engaged ourselves in the struggle for self-rule tended to measure Bangladesh's sense of deprivation in relation to Pakistan in the growing disparities in levels of living and development. The formulation and eventual projection of Bangabandhu's 6-point agenda for self-rule for the Bengalis was derived from these measures of deprivation, conceptualized and computed by the economists. Bangabandhu was the first Bengali leader to prioritize the goal of self-rule for the Bengalis over that of correcting the growing regional disparities. He concluded that whether it would be better to focus his energies on realizing self-rule for the country, whether regional disparities were corrected or not, would now no longer be dependent on the dialectics of governance and resource allocation in Islam, but on the ability and capacity of a self-rule Bangladesh to manage and improve their own fortunes. Ironically, the validation of Bangabandhu's expectations that a self-ruled Bangladesh would greatly improve its own fortunes compared to its association with an integrated Pakistan state could not be validated within the formation of one Pakistan. It has taken us all of half a century to project before the world that an independent Bangladesh could not only correct the disparities between Bangladesh and what was once Pakistan, West Pakistan, but that we could move well ahead of Pakistan in a variety of measures of human endeavor. For purposes of comparing the trajectories of disparity between what was East Pakistan and is now Bangladesh and West Pakistan, now the Pakistan state, I have in my paper presented in an annexure various measures of economic and human development as between West Pakistan and Bangladesh that prevailed in the immediate aftermath of Bangladesh's liberation in the year 1972. This was where the larger part of statistics were available. We have tracked the relative changes in our respective fortunes to midway in our development journey in 1995, and then extended these changes to cover the most recently available figures for the year 2020, or were available for a year or so earlier, which captures the much more dramatic transformation in our developmental fortunes over the last 10 to 12 years. In the case of disparities in per capita income, we also have available comparable figures from the pre-liberation period from 1949-50 to 1969-70 in United Pakistan. The comparative results are quite dramatic. During the Pakistani period, per capita income disparity in favor of West Pakistan increased from 22% in 1949-50 to 61% in 1969-70. This disparity was perpetuated into the post-liberation period, where in 1972, Bangladesh's per capita income was 61% below Pakistan. In the next 13 years, there was some narrowing of the relative differences, but per capita income in 1995 was still 50% below that of West Pakistan. Over the next quarter of a century, a quite dramatic turnaround took place, where by 2020, Bangladesh's per capita income was 64% higher than Pakistan's, an unprecedented turnaround compared to 1969-70. There were quite a number of our table indicates that Bangladesh is not only ahead of Pakistan in per capita income, but in a variety of other macroeconomic indicators. Even in GDP terms, the size of the Bangladesh economy, which was roughly 2/3 that of Pakistan in 1972, is now about 28% larger in 2020. Similarly, in the case of exports, our exports were around half that of Pakistan in 1972, but are now around 20% higher in 2020. As a result, Bangladesh's foreign exchange reserves, which were below Pakistan's both in 1972 and 1995, are now 2.5 times higher than Pakistan's. Because of Bangladesh's strong export performance, largely due to the growth of our RMG exports and our expansion of reserves, we have attained a manageable external debt GDP ratio of 21%, which is close to half that of Pakistan's ratio of 41%. The macroeconomic transformation has been captured through Bangladesh's much faster growth rate compared to Pakistan in the last 25 years, which has now been made possible through Bangladesh attaining a savings GDP ratio by 1920, which is close to 3 times higher than Pakistan. Higher than Pakistan. This is made possible for Bangladesh to attain an investment GDP ratio in 2020, which is double that of Pakistan's. Trajectories of change may be compared by looking at these changes. Bangladesh's higher rates of investment were manifested through the more robust rate of expansion of its infrastructure. Historically, dating back to Pakistan in the 1960s, Bangladesh's power capacity in electricity generation lagged far behind Pakistan's. By 2020, Bangladesh's power generation capacity was around 40% higher than that of Pakistan, largely due to an accelerated expansion of capacity over the last 14 years due to the policies of the incumbent regime. The macroeconomic indicators, however, only indicate part of the story, detailing the transformation in the fortunes of Pakistan and Bangladesh. Even more dramatic changes have been registered in terms of human development. We examined the multidimensional poverty index developed by UNDP, which is a superior measure of human deprivation compared to the standard income poverty measure. Bangladesh's poverty rate, here we have 2018 figures, was 24.6% compared to Pakistan's rate of 38% and India's rate of 28%. The multidimensional index takes into account much broader measures than the standard income measure. It takes into account, for example, literacy rate, which was once well ahead in Pakistan, but we are now ahead of them, ahead in aggregate levels, but particularly in matter of literacy for girls. Similarly, our years of study, again, particularly for girls, have shown Pakistan to be well ahead of Pakistan when we lagged behind in the earlier periods. In a variety of other human development indicators reported in the latest UNDP report, Bangladesh remains ahead. These more accelerated advances have been largely manifested in the 3 decades between 1990 and 2020, and particularly in the last decade. For example, in 1990, the Pakistan Human Development Indicator measure was 0.402, which was ahead of Bangladesh. But by 2019, Bangladesh's HDI had expanded to 0.632 compared to Pakistan's indice of 563. This has been realized because of Bangladesh's faster improvement in its HDI status over 30 years compared to both India and Pakistan, where HDI growth has been the 10th fastest in the world. Demonstrating Bangladesh's achievements in economic and social development compared to Pakistan demonstrates some of the measurable benefits of our independent existence and provides conviction for the high expectations which inspired Bangabandhu and the people of Bangladesh when they embarked on the struggle for self-rule. Whilst independence realized an essential part of the aspirations of the Bengalis, had some changes in our sovereign status not yielded economic, social, and developmental gains, there would have been some cause for frustration. There are a number of post-colonial states who are years after their decolonization, still struggling to reap the benefits of independence. Our quantitative and even qualitative gains in development should not encourage us to lapse into any sense of complacency. For all our advances, even after 50 years, Bangladesh still ranks 133rd out of 189 countries on the HDI index, where human deprivation still remains rampant and conspicuous, while income inequality and social disparities have widened over the last 2 decades. This trend has been fully explored by M.M. Akash in his presentation at this conference. Bangladesh's progress should not be viewed only in quantitative terms. Over 50 years, the very structures of the economy and society have been transformed. These changes will be more fully captured in some of the presentations at this conference. Akhtar Mahmood will be discussing the structural changes realized through the working of market forces, public policy, and investment. Salim Jahan's paper will be exploring the dramatic advances in the social sector. Binoy Sen will be evaluating the sources of our impressive poverty reduction, while Sohela Nazneen will discuss the changes in the circumstances governing women's lives. Bangladesh's time, in my paper, I have a longer discussion here. I simply highlight some of these structural changes, which address the agrarian revolution, which turned us from a food aid dependent country in producing 10 million tons of food grains at the time of liberation to a country which produces now close to 40 million tons of food grains. This has been realized not by large-scale commercial farmers, but by our small subsistence farmers cultivating 1 to 5 acres of land. They have not just expanded our agricultural growth, but have greatly diversified our cropping patterns, have extended the rural economy beyond agriculture into remarkable growth in small and cottage enterprises, into more diversified agricultural activities, and have in fact now contributed to a dynamic rural economy where more than 50% of the household income generated in rural areas comes from non-agricultural activities. On the eve of at the independence of Bangladesh, Bangladesh had a very narrow manufacturing and trading sector, exclusively dependent on the growing of jute, its processing into manufactures, and exporting this. Our jute exports accounted for close to 90% of our exports. In a short period after liberation, jute itself went into decline, and balance of payment circumstances faced serious difficulties. This decline owed to changes in the structures of the global economy. However, this was compensated by the emergence of new areas of foreign exchange earning, particularly in the ready-made garment sector, and then followed by that in the enormous possibilities generated for prospective migrants, largely moving into the rapidly expanding economies of the Middle East, which significantly enhanced our foreign exchange earnings and have now greatly contributed to the strength of our balance of payments and our accumulation of reserves. We have similarly gone through a process of industrial diversification. In recent years, our IT sector has now emerged as a new growth point in the economy. And finally, we have witnessed a quite remarkable expansion of urbanization, not all of it in a very comfortable or planned way. We have similarly gone through very dramatic social transformation. And here again, we have to take into account the ways in which society has been totally transformed. We have witnessed the emergence of a new generation of first-time entrepreneurs who came of age as drivers of Bangladesh's economic transformation and social revolution. But what is important is that these entrepreneurs are not just limited to the corporate class living in the Gulshan, Baridara, Banani, and Dhanmandi areas, but include the young entrepreneurs who have emerged at all levels of the economy and are now increasingly active in the IT sector, who are providing financial services and driving a variety of innovative activities in both the rural and urban areas. A much broader constituency of entrepreneurs can be identified. I briefly spell these out. I've already mentioned the contribution of the small peasants who have quadrupled our food grain production and diversified the rural economy. Innumerable entrepreneurs, men and women, in the areas of medium, small, and micro enterprises. The poor rural women who have come out of the seclusion of their homes to use microfinance to set up household-based micro enterprises. The working women who have traveled out of their village spaces to fuel the growth of our RMG sector. The entrepreneurial spirit demonstrated by our migrant workers, mostly from low-income families who have taken unimaginable risks across the world in order to improve the conditions of their families. The NGOs who have emerged as social entrepreneurs, delivering social services which have contributed to human development changes. The digital entrepreneurs who are changing the way we do business, deliver financial products, and provide a growing variety of services. And furthermore, we also must take into account entrepreneurs in such areas as the theater, fine arts, and music, who have not only enriched our cultural life, but have contributed to the secularization and democratization of our consciousness. Keeping these remarkable changes in mind, we can visualize that Bangabandhu, if he could review this progress, you were with us, would in fact feel that a very important component of the promises he made to Bangladesh, to the people of Bangladesh, have been kept. However, we have observed that when Bangabandhu promised the struggle for Bangladesh would go ahead, he also believed that for the people, the struggle for liberation would also move forward. This second struggle, however, did not reach its journey's end with the emergence of Bangladesh and has remained ongoing over the last 50 years. If we are to fully realize Bangabandhu's promise that Ebare Shongram would also extend to Amader Mukti Shongram, this promise will only be realized when we create a more just society, as visualized by Bangabandhu. The remaining part of the paper addresses this aspect of the journey. First, what do we understand by a just society? Bangabandhu's vision was realized in his lifetime, but we are still working to realize this just society. We have witnessed remarkable changes, but the negative aspects of the entrepreneurial revolution have also been manifested in growing economic inequality, widening social disparities, and political exclusion, which would have concerned Bangabandhu. I have, for purposes of discussion, narrowed my interpretation of the idea of justice and injustice. There's a much wider literature inspired by scholars like Amartya Sen and Rawls who have addressed this. I'm looking at the issue in a much more functional perspective. For purposes of my analysis, I focus on the importance of addressing this with a view to taking corrective action. I accordingly define injustice at two levels. Injustice manifested through unjust governance and the more deep-rooted structural injustice. Unjust governance relates to a great variety of injustices perpetuated through failure to fairly implement proclaimed public policies, equitably enforce established laws, and transparently administer public regulations. Structural justice originates in the inequitable access to economic opportunity and the undemocratic access to political power inbuilt in the economic, social, and political structures of our society. It is argued that the scope for establishing a more justly governed society is available to most societies, but particularly to Bangladesh. It lies within the power of our government, particularly since it is headed by a leader who is herself strongly committed to realize Bangabandhu's vision and today commands virtually unchallenged political power to openly and fairly implement policies which are already in effect, to universally and without qualification enforce the laws of the land, as well as exercise law enforcement to ensure that enacted regulations are applied to all concerned. Addressing structural adjustment remains far more challenging because it requires the introduction of new policies, often backed by legislation, which may have distributive implications, as well as institutional reforms, which together challenge the prevailing political economy, which influences both public and private actions. To bring about structural change may require more than just legislative action and may require strong social and political mobilization. In the conclusion of my paper, I will address the possibilities of challenging both governance and structural injustice within the prevailing circumstances of Bangladesh. How much time do I have? Chair? No, well.
Well, if you can, if you can conclude in the next 10 minutes, then I think it will be very good. Then we would have a little bit of a time for Q&A. So, or 8 minutes if you can. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think if I am to complete this in the next 10 minutes or so, then I think I should move on to really address the concrete initiatives which can actually be taken to address the problems of structural, of both unjust governance and structural change. First, let me briefly address the issue of the quest for just governance. The scope for just governance may be addressed under 4 heads. A just democracy, better economic governance, correcting educational injustice, and challenging environmental injustice. Many more areas are there available where more just governance would be appropriate, but we do not have the time to address these. In these areas, we observe again that it lies within the power of a well-intentioned government to immediately address various aspects of injustice by enforcement of the law and through improving and democratizing its governance practices. If we want to realize a just democracy, we have to ensure that our institutions of democracy operate on just principles. And this decision remains largely within the domain of the regime in power. If today the government decides that the forthcoming elections to the Jatiya Sangshad will be genuinely free, fair, and fully inclusive, it can initiate such a process immediately. It can establish an institutional mechanism, preferably through legislation, but even by executive order, to select the next election commission. Such mechanisms will be. The operative issue would, of course, remain that if you set up an election commission, which can be genuinely non-partisan and can empower it to preside over the elections, whether they would remain even a fully re-empowered election commission, would retain the power to fully enforce its authority over the machinery of government over the years. Over the years, this machinery for conducting the elections in the form of the local administration and law enforcement authorities have become increasingly partisanized. In such circumstances, it may be argued that holding free and fair elections under an incumbent government may have acquired a structural dimension where mere good intentions of a regime may not be enough to ensure the integrity of the electoral process. Secondly, let us address the issue of just governance. I do this through the lens of the default crisis. Again, correcting the lingering default crisis, which has been with us over 4 decades, would again be within the power of an incumbent regime, where the established regulatory body, the Bangladesh Bank, has been invested with full freedom to assert its regulatory powers, invested on it under law. It can take action against persistent defaulters and take punitive action against malfeasant conduct of banks. Here, again, as we have observed, at the end of the day, it is up to the will of the government, out of both political commitment and economic necessity, to invest the Bangladesh Bank with its full authority to take all actions within its power against both defaulters and malfeasant bankers. Similarly, drawing on the laws of the land, the government can enforce in other areas a more effective and competitive process. What we have observed, for example, is that competitive processes are not fully operative in many areas of bidding for public contracts, particularly in various stages of the development process. Here again, if the government so desires, it can do so. As far as education is concerned, the government in its 8th five-year plan has committed itself as part of its commitment to SDG 10 to ensure quality of education. But again, this is a provision which needs to be enforced, and we need to ensure that it isn't simply ensuring quality education, but it addresses the growing disparities between private education available to elite and the public educational system. Major investments have to be made in public education, and there should be a transformation in the governance processes. Finally, we need to address the issue of environmental injustice. Here again, the government has made commendable commitments towards meeting its international obligations under the COP and has taken important steps in adaptation and mitigation. It may, however, be noted that it is the upper income groups who remain the largest abuser of the environment through their more intensive usage of fossil fuels, or through, as well as the uses of water per capita. Abuse of the environment is particularly evident in certain areas of the business sector involved in property development and infrastructure development, unregulated building in urban areas, appropriation of water bodies by property developers and infrastructure developers are all practiced outside the law and constitute criminal acts. Regulatory failures owing to the abuses of the environment, backed by widespread resort to bribery, can be corrected by a committed government. And I would expect that a government which has strongly proclaimed its commitment to addressing climate change would be very active in this area. Finally, I want to spend the last 5 minutes or so in addressing the issue of structural change. In the concluding part, I point out that structural change remains integral to the realization of a just society. His commitment to the idea of a socialist society, which he proclaimed through various public declarations prior to and after liberation, and had it incorporated in the Constitution, was no less close to his heart. He embraced such a commitment for a just society based on his lived experience amongst the common people of Bangladesh. While enforcing the equitable and just application of existing policies and regulations remains an essential step towards Bangabandhu's vision for a just society, much more needs to be done to challenge the exploitative relations of production which so deeply concern Bangabandhu. Here, some of the areas where such structural interventions are needed and may be possible are identified by me in this paper. They are much more broader area, but the two I address relate to the need for inequitable access to productive assets and inequitable participation in the marketplace. In all countries faced with growing inequality, and indeed many middle-income countries, inequitable access to wealth and knowledge disempower the poor from progressively competing in the marketplace. In rural areas of Bangladesh, large proportions of the population remain landless and land poor. Small farmers have proven to be both more productive as well as likely to spend most of their income derived from meager assets in stimulating secondary activity in the rural economy. Distribution of assets in the urban areas also tend to be even more inequitable than within the rural areas. Access to both income-generating assets, particularly corporate wealth, as well as residential property is sharply skewed. Similarly, we find that the prevailing property structures of society, the resource poor, particularly in the rural areas, remain disconnected from the more dynamic sectors of the market, particularly where there is scope for benefiting opportunities provided by globalization. The resource poor interface with the more dynamic sectors of the economy only as primary producers, service providers, and wage earners at the lowest end of the production chain. In order to address these concerns, I have proposed that we need to address policies for correcting structural inequalities through strengthening the capacity of the poor to compete in the marketplace and through expanding the ownership and control of the resource poor over productive assets. I have addressed these extensively in a variety of other areas, so I don't think I will really further go into this. As and when my paper is eventually published, you will have access to that. In conclusion, I would wish to point out that at the end of the day, structural change remains the long-term political project. And demands a much more politically committed regime willing to challenge the prevailing political economy in society. Such a regime will need to decide whether it has the capacity to embark on the road to change in order to realize Bangabandhu's goal of Mukti Sangram. If it is disinclined to do so, because such radical commitments may in fact be beyond its capacity, then at least it should spell out to the people that vision, that the goals that it is now pursuing in the second quarter of the 21st century may not be similar to goals which inspired Bangabandhu's vision, which he proclaimed in the third quarter of the 20th century. This is a decision which has to be taken both by the government and the people of Bangladesh as to the extent to which we are willing to commit ourselves to realize Bangabandhu's vision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Soban. This is a very a lot of arguments and a vast landscape. I think that if we want to close our session, because we have another session starting at 8 o'clock. So, and I think we need at least 10 minutes break. So by my watch, it is 7:25. So perhaps Dr. Fahmida Khatun can entertain only a few questions, maybe not more than 10 minutes. And only if there are any questions that are specific to Professor Soban, then he will answer those questions. Otherwise, if there are mainly comments, you can lump them together and you can read it out. Anyway, Fahmida, you are an expert in this. I leave it in your hands then.
Thank you. Thank you. In the question and answer tab, I see there is one question from someone, anonymous attendee. So there's one question, but I think you will also have to invite the participants to make their comments or questions. So let me just read out this question I guess this is to Professor Raymond Soban. So the question is, how can we revive democratic system in Bangladesh in present context? Is it possible to establish a rule of law under current circumstances? So this is the question.
Yes, maybe if is there only one question? I see two questions now in the Q&A. So then maybe read out a few questions and then Professor Soban can start answering. Or if you think that if in the 10 minutes, then Professor Soban should just take up this question. If there is only one question, then I would request Professor Soban then to
yeah, there's only one question. The other ones are just the name of the,
Okay. All right. Okay. So
shall I repeat? You have to unmute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Let me repeat the question. How can we revive?
I've followed the question.
Okay, sir. So
Yeah.
it's
well,
the question is to you.
The central assumption of my presentation was that this clearly depends on the intentions and commitment of an incumbent government. There is nothing impossible in realizing democracy and holding competitive elections if a government so desires. Whether they will in fact actually, a government will actually exercise its will to hold free, fair and competitive elections is something which we have to sort of wait and see. I mean, we can get into a range of speculative arguments over whether this is possible or not, but I don't think in a short question and answer session, this would be feasible.
There is Mr. Mohammad Musleuddin. He wanted to make a comment. So if you can make a short comment, please, then it would be useful. So there's another question. While Mr. Musleuddin,
you can speak now.
Okay. He can speak now, yeah. So then I'll come back to the questions later on. There's another question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fahmida. I really want to thank CPD leadership and yourself for this 4-day well-organized program internationally. A couple of just general comments. I don't dare to question Professor Raymond Soban, highly respected by all of us. So we are proud of him, but bluntly, we would like actually to see him more leadership, what is going on in the country. Bluntly, if I say no justice, no democracy, no justice nowhere, even globally. So we want to see, as Professor Raymond Soban, bluntly said it, unchallenged political situation is going on. Rule of one leadership, we cannot accept this. Bangabandhu is Bangabandhu. What he said, we are working for vote and bhat, and now no vote. Whatever nomination given to the vote, they are straightway winner. So we would like to see, honestly, a change. And people like Professor Raymond Soban, if they are not speaking out, we do not expect any change. So we want to see, his paper was elegant, excellent, covered everything. We are proud of you, but bluntly, as a retired professor of Dhaka University, we want to see people, our educationists, our, whoever working non-political has to come forward to get the leadership that country cannot run this way. Look at just Pratham Alo, amra jodi pori, you see the injustice. Professor Ronald Jahan ek shomoy bolechilen, আমাদের ভবিষ্যৎ হচ্ছে এই যে বাচ্চারা দেশ চালাচ্ছে, গত এক সপ্তাহ কোনো গভর্নেন্স নাই দেশে, মানুষ বাসা থেকে বের হতে পারে না। And look at all the killings, একটা killings এর কোনো বিচার হয়নি। Look at the justice department, the justice is dictated. এই যে পরিমণি বলি, তারপর অন্যান্য জিনিসগুলো দেখেন, এগুলো তো কান্না আসে, এই দেশ আমাদের। I live in the US, but since we are all Bangladeshi, we really feel for us. We feel for our future. Inequality kotha bolechen, inequality kothay geche. The comparison Professor Raymond Soban dekhiyechen, we are much ahead of Pakistan, no doubt about it. But we really have to get into the democracy, human rights, and freedom of speech. Thank you, Professor Raymond Soban, for your excellent presentation.
Mohammad Musliuddin, can you please introduce yourself?
I was professor and chairperson, Department of Statistics, Dhaka University. And then later I worked for the United Nations. I taught at the United Nations Statistical Institute for Asia Pacific, which is based in Tokyo. I taught there for about 8 years, all international students coming from like 40 plus countries. It used to be a 6-month course. Now I teach in the US as a part-time adjunct professor in a couple of universities here in Indiana. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions, so let me just read out those. There are 2 questions on the chat box. Jeff Wood has questioned, socioeconomic progress in the last 50 years has not really been via socialist principles. Should this be abandoned as an objective for the society? So this is a question from Jeff Wood. And then Muhammad Samiul Islam, he has questioned why government is not executed good governance in the development programs, how it can be overcome. So these are the 2 questions, and there's another question. So more questions are coming. So shall I read out more questions, sir? And then you will...
Pamita, yes, please read out some of the questions, and then I think because we would be running short of time, so let us get a flavor of the questions, and then Professor Soban can just speak and choose. If that is what is agreeable with Professor Soban, do you want to, because of the, let us hear a few questions, and then I think he can decide what, some are more comments, so we don't really, there are not questions, but you can for the next maybe 4 minutes, and then we have to stop.
Okay, I have 2 more questions. One is by Mr. Ghaffur.
What was the last question, please?
The last question is why government is not executed. He means probably executing good governance in the development programs. How can it be overcome? So it's about governance, and the first one was about the socialist principles. So should it be abandoned?
Right,
and then another question from Mr. Ghaffur. He says, although Bangladesh has made a substantial progress since her independence in terms of economic growth and development, we see after 50 years of independence, people are terribly busy in self-censorship. Nobody dares to speak up. Was this our expectation? How could we change this unexpected scenario? Then there's another question from Mr. Ali Hassan Nishat. He says, is our capitalist class stable? What is the current condition of capitalist base in our country? What is the problem in our transport sector? So this is, and then there's one question in the Facebook. So this has been posed by Rizvi Nawaz of Channel I. He says that what is unjust government? How does SAR describe the present government? So these are the 5 questions for the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we should not entertain any more questions. So unless there is something that you think is very burning. So over to you, Professor Soban, if you can very briefly answer.
There is another question, similar question. I mean, this is from Dr. Khondokar Ghulam Muazzam. From our own
okay, all right, yes.
He says, under the existing politico-economic structure, how to attain the distributive justice, particularly in terms of distribution of assets. Dr. Khondokar, I don't know, probably is it. Which I could read only Dr. Khundukar, but not I'm not sure whether it's Dr. Khundukar, Ghulam Muazzam, or somebody else. But anyway, so yes,
Okay.
it is, yeah.
Well, let me quickly, first a quick response to Mr. Masliuddin. I share his concerns, but his invitation to someone at the age of 86 to in fact assume leadership roles is a bit ambitious. At this stage in life, and actually not just at this stage in life, but for virtually all my life, I have attempted to speak out on a variety of issues, going back to the issue of disparities in the Pakistan period. But mostly one has spoken out through one's writing and public presentations in gatherings. I have not stood on any political platform, and these observations and writings have been noticed by various leaders. Some have made use of them, others have simply ignored them, a few have actively opposed them. So that's the situation as it exists. At this stage in life, one does not envisage any significant departure from that particular approach. So I think what I do promise is that I am going to be writing a good deal less, if anything at all, in the days ahead. I think I am now also reaching the end of my writing days. I think this paper, which incidentally is longer, somewhat more complex paper than the one I have presented before you, which addresses a number of questions which were raised over here. Now, over here, let me see, Jeff Wood, point is a perfectly valid one. I mean, we have made socio-economic progress. And obviously, to the extent that we have made socio-economic progress under the present dispensation, nothing much should be done to, in fact, really move to frustrate that particular process. Obviously, progress is better than, in fact, backward movement or no movement at all. Certainly, our social indicators have improved greatly. I think what I have emphasized over here is that both in the social and economic area, great disparities have emerged, so that in fact, whilst education and healthcare have in fact spread widely, its distribution is highly inequitable, and this is in fact perpetuating inequalities at the social and political level. In fact, we may well be witnessing the emergence of a new ruling class, which is increasingly divided by education rather than just sort of income or assets from the rest of the population. And this is becoming self-reproducing because their offspring are then moving into spaces created by their moving out. So unless you can really invest and enhance the quality of public education to levels which are available at the private level, you have serious problems. And similar disparities prevail in the healthcare sector. And of course, in the competitive processes in the market, as also in terms of the way in which people compete for getting the benefits of public expenditure. You have, of course, worked on these issues and are fully conscious of this. So these are all areas where major actions are required to create a more just society. And I have discussed this in this paper, and of course have addressed this more extensively in other writings, as have you. As far as the observation which was made about self-censorship, well, of course, everyone is practicing a degree of self-censorship. and you have to think about what you write. I've often pointed out that when I was much younger, I could finish a paper in 1 hour. Today, it may take me 1 week to finish that same paper because I have to constantly think about its content. In a society which would have been closer to Bangabandhu's vision in our dreams when we struggle for Bangladesh, one would like to be in a position to be able to say whatever you want. I mean, there are obviously specific libel laws and laws which would constrain, which would put some limits on this. But for expressions of dissent and constructive observations on what are going on, there should be unqualified freedom to express ourselves, whether in print or whether speaking out or whether in the electronic media. And not having this, I feel, is a significant retreat from the commitments we have made at the time of our liberation. Certainly, we should recapture this process. Oh yes, is Bangladesh's capitalist class stable? Well, there are some elements of instability there, certainly in the way in which a default culture has now been perpetuated. This is generating considerable concern about the stability of the financial sector. We have to keep in mind that the financial sector is now largely made up of lending by commercial banks, which basically are supplied by the deposits of millions of small depositors of all sizes, including, of course, the big depositors. And the policy of, in fact, using these deposits for long-term lending, which is then not repaid on time, is creating a serious structural crisis within the financial system. And here we have to keep in mind that we are also permitting the emergence of serious uncompetitive forces working in the financial sector. This I have, of course, talked about. That there are obviously a large number of borrowers, even amongst the capitalist class, who service their loans on time, are not defaulters, and make productive use of their resources. To the extent that there's a community of regular defaulters, some on a very large scale, who actually can get loans rescheduled and then written off, certainly they are not competing on a level playing field with the rest of the competitors in the marketplace. And of course, quite a bit of this, these sort of defaulted loans may well end up by being laundered outside the country. So that again is a factor contributing to instability in the system. So these are areas which any government which aspires to reach developed country status by 2021 will need to address. You cannot really continue on that route without making qualitative changes in the structures and governance of your financial sector and other sectors of the other sectors in the economy. Of course, what is the problem in the transport sector and why is nothing being done about it? I suppose part of the problem is that it is one of the sectors which is characterized by regulatory failure. And central to this is the difficulty in addressing both the owners as well as the unions in this particular sector, who have acquired enormous power and influence, derive from the capacity to bring the country to a standstill. So unless this issue is confronted, this problem will continue, both in terms of the problems created by an unregulated transport sector and the problems in properly disciplining it. What is unjust governance? And well, of course, I've pointed out there's a whole range of areas of unjust governance. I've only spoken to address some of these. There are many other areas which can be discussed. Essentially, what I identify as unjust governance is that you have existing laws and regulations, and when you do not enforce them, or when you enforce them inequitably, where you apply your regulations to some people while other people are exempted from this, you enforce loan recovery from some and you reschedule others, you in fact permit people to violate particular laws, and others are in fact exposed to legal action. That constitutes a system of unjust governance, and unless regulations and laws are uniformly observed, they will never be enforceable, because there will always be groups of people who believe that they are above the law and have the necessary backing or also the resources to in fact actually evade the law. And what you really need, again in our journey to 2041, is recognition that the rule of law is very central to the type of society we aspire to create in the future.
Thank you, Professor Soban. I think because we have another session coming up, those of you who have asked questions and want to continue this dialogue with Professor Soban, you can always write to him via email. He is very willing to engage with people in dialogue. So I would urge people who have questions which cannot be now answered, that they can engage. If they want to engage with him, they can send emails to him. And then some of the questions which have been raised about the current state of our democracy, our next session, which you should start in, I think, 10 minutes from now, that is that is on politics. It is on state, society, and politics. So you can raise your questions in the second session. But I think in terms of what can be done, I think each of us should ask ourselves what we as individuals can do where we have our own strength. It is not an academic has his or her strength, an activist or a politician has his or her strength. So from our own strength, I think we should work to reach whatever is our goal. Let me now try to conclude this session. I'm not going to sum this up because it is just the beginning of a conversation. And many interesting questions have been raised and will be raised. And I would only want to thank all the paper writers, chairs, and discussants who have agreed to present papers and discuss and chair. And my particular thanks to CPD and all the silent work that has gone on behind under Dr. Fahmida Khatun's able leadership that has brought us here. And my special thanks to Professor Iftikhar Dadi, who actually was the first person who told me about the importance of art and architecture. he had been trying very hard to organize several panels on Bangladesh, either in USA or in Pakistan. And I'm very glad that finally, then at least he had been able to co-sponsored this event, but I had not before. Professor Dadi sent me some of these names and ideas. I was not thinking about this. So my special thanks to Professor Dadi. My final message to all the participants as we begin this conversation, that there is an urgent need globally, and also Bangladesh is no exception in Bangladesh, to restore an environment of public reasoning, an environment where we tolerate our differences with civility and engage in reasoned discussion and debate. And finally, that we must all learn to listen more and talk a bit less. So thank you very much for your patience. And I think we will take a short break, and then we will start our next session at 8 o'clock. And my special thanks to Professor Raymond Soban, that even though I conceptualized this program, but he has been, I was not following it up very closely. And it is Professor Soban who has been really writing to all the paper writers, reminding them. And not only that, he was reading everybody's papers and sending comments. And I kept telling him that instead of reading other people's papers, he should finish writing his own paper. But he gets very engaged in, if he gets an interesting idea, and tries to engage with people. And so that is why those of you who raised questions or may want to raise questions later on, I would just say that Professor Soban would welcome engagement with younger people and also his own generation. And he likes discussion, debate very much. Thank you very much. And I would like to now thank everybody and close this session.